When you look at an oxidized copper round like this one, do you see a filthy coin or potential resource for treating wounds? In a world after societal collapse, echoes of the past may linger in crumbling, musty structures like hospitals and pharmacies, but they won't be capable of providing the care they once did and will eventually be stripped bare of the modern things manufactured before the collapse. The need for alternatives becomes paramount to survival. Where could copper come in, and what could this oxidized residue possibly be used for? I'll share that in just a moment. Hello, fellow mutants. Some of you have commented that you enjoy the many ways I've found that make copper a good choice for stacking in one form or another, whether you invest in it as a hedge against societal collapse or inflation. My choice of copper for a new era is not arbitrary. It's grounded in practicality and the unique properties of the metal that set it apart. Today, I'm going to touch on a different aspect of our favorite orange metal that may be new for you. The versatility of copper as a material for rebuilding and other applications go beyond its role as a currency. From crafting tools and parts to its use in various technical applications, copper's multifaceted nature gives it value for a civilization clawing its way back to some semblance of what came before. Of course, there are alternatives and no reason to focus on copper to the exclusion of everything else. I do diversify. Unlike silver, gold, or wampum for that matter, however, copper can be used for a variety of survivalist purposes when not being toted around in your pockets as a currency. For example, cleaner and more sterile vessels can be formed and made from copper to hold water. This is because copper has broad-spectrum antimicrobial properties. It can kill microorganisms like bacteria and viruses if the microorganisms come in contact with the copper. Copper has antimicrobial efficacy against some of the most toxic species of bacteria, fungi, and viruses. It's explained rather simply. The bactericidal activity of copper can be attributed to copper's release of ions, which affect the integrity of the membrane and/or the bacterial wall of living microbes, generating intracellular oxidative stress. This makes copper genotoxic, resulting in the death of microorganisms that could otherwise lead to infections. In a post-apocalyptic world, infection is a major threat. Something as simple as a small cut may lead to death when modern antibacterial ointments in pharmacies are no longer to be found. Tools for treating wounds could be crafted from copper with its antimicrobial properties, but there is another use for copper, which is an old one, recently seeing new use. One thing I've yet to mention on this channel is copper salts, primarily copper oxide, though it's not the only form of copper salts. Copper tarnish is a layer of chemical compounds that form on the surface of the metal when it reacts with molecules in the air, such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide. This reaction is called oxidation, and it changes the color of copper from its reddish-brown to black and eventually green. Most coin collectors would consider copper tarnish as a nuisance that hides the natural luster of the metal, but some have looked beyond that and thought, wow, that's something I'd like to scrape off and use in a wound inside a bandage. Well, I'm not sure that's exactly how it initially worked, but eventually that's what happened. It's a fascinating subject, and though I'll admit I'm no chemist, hedge wizard, or barber surgeon, I can read and looked into the claims I had seen around copper being used for medicinal purposes. Copper has been used since ancient times in medicine, though you might be hard-pressed to name how specifically copper is still used today, with the exception perhaps of copper-infused bandages or sports socks, or, for that matter, even pillows that boast antimicrobial properties. I had to dig around a bit for more information on this, and found that a company called MedCU, so named for the name of the element in the periodic table, offers copper-infused wound dressings with copper microparticles. I am tempted to pick up some myself as a survivalist, since they have impressive properties, and studies show copper outperforming similar silver-infused copper wound dressings. Having a wound dressing that provides additional protection against infection may be almost as good as antibiotics, and the MedCU site claims the dressings can be left on for as many as 7 days. It's also worth notice that the practice of using copper salts to treat wounds and illnesses may have taken something of a hiatus, but it dates back to the times of ancient Egyptians and Greeks. Some of you may be familiar with silver oxide, which is well known as a broad-spectrum antimicrobial material. Colloidal silver is another you may have heard of, which involves suspending silver nanoparticles in a liquid. This sort of process would likely be much more complex in a post-apocalyptic scenario than obtaining copper salts, not to mention the relative rarity of silver. Recognizing copper's antimicrobial properties, the ancient Egyptians appear to have used copper salts in wound care to prevent infections. Though how much they used has been lost to time, it's been suggested that they could have applied these salts directly or mixed them with various substances to create ointments or solutions. The earliest documentation of copper's medicinal applications can be traced back to the Smith Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical text dating between 2600 and 2200 BC. Within its pages, the use of copper for disinfecting chest wounds and purifying drinking water is recorded. Another historical source, the Ebers Papyrus from around 1500 BC, provides additional insights into copper's medicinal roles in ancient Egyptian and other civilizations, predating it by centuries. Remedies involving copper compounds were recommended for diverse conditions such as headaches, limb tremors, potentially indicating epilepsy or St. Vitus's dance, burn wounds, itching, and neck growths, likely including boils. The therapeutic forms of copper ranged from metallic splinters and shavings to various naturally occurring copper salts and oxides. The text mentions a green pigment, likely malachite, a copper carbonate, chrysocolla, a copper silicate, or even copper chloride formed when copper is exposed to seawater. In the 1st century AD, Dioscorides, in his work De Materia Medica, detailed the creation of verdigris, a green pigment, by exposing metallic copper to boiling vinegar vapors. This process led to the formation of blue-green copper acetate on the copper surface. Both verdigris and blue vitriol, copper sulfate, found application in remedies for eye ailments such as bloodshot eyes, inflammation, bleary eyes, presence of fat in the eyes, potentially trachoma, and cataracts. In the Hippocratic collection, attributed to the Greek physician Hippocrates, 460 to 380 BC, although not entirely authored by him, there is a recommendation for the use of copper in treating leg ulcers associated with varicose veins. To prevent infection in fresh wounds, the Greeks employed a dry powder comprising copper oxide and copper sulfate, which was sprinkled directly onto the wounds. Another antiseptic method for wound treatment during that era involved a boiled mixture of honey and red copper oxide. The Greeks had convenient access to copper as the metal was readily obtainable on the island of Kypros, or Cyprus, from which the Latin name for copper, cuprum, is actually derived. While I would not claim to dispense proper medical advice, it's an option to consider in the face of a lack of antibiotics post-apocalypse. After using a strong alcohol for initial cleaning of an open wound, one might apply copper salts obtained through oxidized copper underneath standard bandages in an effort to create a protective barrier against further infection. So, how would you go about obtaining copper salts yourself, once online shopping is no longer available in your neck of the woods? As the ancients did, of course. Here are a few methods. Copper oxidation. Copper metal could be exposed to air and moisture, leading to natural oxidation. This process results in the formation of copper oxide, a compound that can be used in various medical applications. Interaction with acids. Egyptians may have used natural acids, such as those found in fruits like lemons or vinegar, to interact with copper. This could produce copper salts through a reaction between the acid and the copper metal. Boiling in water. Boiling copper in water could lead to the formation of copper salts. This method may have been used to create solutions for topical applications or wound care. For a post-apocalyptic society with primitive equipment and no electricity, emulating some of the ancient Egyptian or Greek medicinal practices involving copper could be feasible. Here are a few possibilities, which again, I must stress, are theoretical and coming from someone with no medical background who just likes to research and read a lot. Copper-based wound care. Utilize basic metalworking skills to shape copper into various forms like splinters or shavings. These can be applied to wounds as an antiseptic similar to historical practices. I suspect this would be the least effective since it is copper in its normal non-oxidized form and in large pieces. However, clean copper wire could be used like modern medical staples to help close and secure an open wound. Natural oxidation. Expose copper objects to the elements to allow natural oxidation. This resulting copper oxide could be collected and used for medicinal purposes such as treating wounds or skin conditions. Allowing the shavings I mentioned to naturally oxidize would produce a more desirable effect, theoretically speaking. Acid-based reactions. Extract natural acids from fruits or vinegar and then use them to interact with copper. This could produce basic copper salts that may have antimicrobial properties for topical applications. Herbal mixtures. Combine copper compounds with locally available herbs or substances with potential medicinal properties. The Egyptians often used a combination of different materials in their medical treatments, and any one of these may tip the scales toward an effective treatment. Cauterization techniques. Explore primitive cauterization techniques using heated copper implements. While painful, this could be used for wound closure or to address specific medical conditions. Now let's look at a simple process for harvesting copper oxide. What materials would you need? An oxidized copper object, like a copper round. This copper material would have undergone oxidation and developed a layer of tarnish or copper oxide. A scraping tool. A simple scraping tool such as a knife, some sort of blade, or any sharp-edged object. What procedure would you use? Well, first you would inspect the copper object, ensure that the copper has undergone sufficient oxidation, and a noticeable layer of copper oxide has formed on the surface, which you can test by scraping some away. You would gently scrape the surface of the copper with the scraping tool, so as not to mix the oxidized with non-oxidized shavings. Collect this scraped copper oxide as it comes off the surface. Store the collected copper oxide in a secure container. This could be a makeshift pouch, a small bag, or any available storage option, but preferably would be something that you can seal. Some other considerations. Avoid contaminants. Be mindful of any contaminants that might be present on the surface of the oxidized copper. If possible, clean the scraped copper oxide to remove any impurities. Store the harvested copper oxide in a dry and secure place to prevent further reactions or contamination. The quantity of copper oxide obtained, of course, would depend on the size of the object and the duration of the oxidation process. It's important to note that any attempts to replicate These historical practices should prioritize your own safety and hygiene. Once more, I am no medical expert, so understanding the potential benefits and risks of treatments is crucial before implementing them in any medical context. In a post-apocalyptic setting, however, where you have no access to antibiotics, resourcefulness, experimentation, and a cautious approach would be key elements in developing and adapting new or rediscovering old, ancient medical practices with a resource like copper salts. If you collect copper as I do, it's a resource like any other. If you were to experiment with copper-based wound care in a primitive setting, it would be wise to start with small quantities and concentrations to observe the effects and avoid any potential adverse reactions that could make a bad situation worse. The goal, of course, would be to strike a balance between achieving your desired effect and minimizing any unintended harm. As the copper skies of sunset draw down on a Texas night, it's here that I'll conclude my observations on copper's potential medical uses. Well, that's all I have for today, fellow mutants. Until next time, it's Copper Mutant, signing out.